Hi and welcome to the channel. Today I want to have a sound design talk with you about this patch inspired on the synth from the song Ingenue by Atoms for Peace. This sound is a bit special because it serves both as a lead sound and as a bass. In the original recording by Atoms for Peace, Nigel Godrich used the Korg MS-20, a monophonic classic, but instead of me trying to faithfully recreate this sound, I had this idea to try to use the Roland SE-02, more specifically its feedback loop, to create some sort of Ingenue synth on steroids. And in the process of designing this sound, I came across 3 different learnings that I want to share with you today. First, we're going to look into what makes a good bass sound and how this sound can be both bass and lead. My second learning was around creating the feeling that what you play in the keys are played in reverse. And last but not least, I want to show you my learnings around saturation and resonance. Recently I've stumbled upon Jameson Nathan Jones' video around synth bass. He very well explains something that I've perceived in practice, that a warm and rich synth sound has at its core a clear fundamental, or in other words, it is a sine wave. If you use a sine wave as a bass, this will give you a solid lower frequency tone, but as a side effect, you lose in character and timbre. Jamerson mentioned that he would overlay a sine wave sub-oscillator with a sawtooth sound, in which he would filter out all the lower frequencies, keeping only the rich harmonic content of the sawtooth, and this composition would result in this chest vibrating bass, but with character and timbre. However, he learned with time that for being able to reduce the complexity and actually play this synth sound live, he could use a filtered square wave as a sound source instead. This would result in a sine wave waveform but still have harmonic content in the higher frequencies. Let's see this in practice. Here, I have only one oscillator as my sound source, and it is set to square or pulse. And when we look here into my filter, the cutoff frequency is almost completely closed. By filtering different waveforms that much with a low pass filter, what we end up with is a sine wave. But this is not all. The fact that we have key track engaged means that the higher I go on my key speech, the ever more slightly my cutoff frequency will open. Letting more of the odd harmonic content of this square wave go through. And this is also part why this sound can play a double role of lead in the higher octaves and bass on the lower register. But the other characteristic of Nigel and Tom is this tension of always being on your toes in a dreamy landscape. I think a big factor for that in Ingenue is this impression that the sounds are being played backwards. This was one of my starting points when designing this sound. If you think about the ADSR envelope paradigm, an instrument like the piano will have a very fast attack when the hammer hits the string, quite fast decay onto the instrument amplitude sustain level, and of course the physical instrument will slowly decay into silence. But if we want to mimic this pattern in reverse, what we can do is to actually elongate our attack time in my amplitude envelope here, and also have this short decay, which will move our amplitude lever to a relatively high sustain there. Or at least this was my thinking here in my amplitude envelope, with 1 second attack, about 50 milliseconds decay, and my sustain level of about 60%, number 6 there. And what is interesting about this envelope dynamics is that it almost forces you to play in a very specific way. I've already mentioned Smashing Pumpkins' Billy Corgan interview to Rick Beato, where he talks about how certain pedal and amplifier will make him strum the guitar in a different way, in another rhythm, due to the feedback that he will receive from his signal chain. This is exactly the case for me here in this sound design, because the envelope times are indicative of how long should I hold my F sharp here and finally articulate the melody with the time that is left for me on the bar. And this in itself creates tension. It's a kind of a rush to catch up with tempo. I did many tests in the sound design, having a single envelope to modulate the wave amplitude and the filter cutoff frequency, but I ended up using both envelopes I have available in the SE-02, because the ever slight differences between the envelope here modulating my amplitude and the envelope modulating my cutoff frequency played a big role for me on how the harmonics I was generating from my feedback loop were tuned. But I'll explain more of that when we talk about saturation. But okay, to summarize, the reverse effect illusion is caused by this long attack and decay in a relatively high sustain here, mimicking the reverse image of a natural instrument attack, decay and release. Let's talk a little bit now about saturation. I didn't want to simply reproduce Ingenue synth sound. I wanted more buzz. I wanted to emphasize the frequencies that attracted me to that sound in the first place. And this is why I have resourced the SE-02. I wanted to make more videos on this little machine here, because not even the real Mini Moog gave me the saturation sound that Studio Electronics was giving on this feedback loop. But the problem with feedback is that it is related to the main output volume of your system. You know how the feedback trick is made, by feeding your output signal back into the mixer, and this creates a constructive interference to your original waveform, creating resonance and even new harmonics. But every time I tried in a Mini Moog territory to mess with feedback, I would have very little headroom to overdrive the sound before I get to that point where the level of feedback is so high that I even lose the pitch information. So I have started to look into how guitar players do when they want their valve amp to be very saturated with a controlled volume. And the trick there is that they use attenuators, as expensive as their valve amps, to be able to saturate the valves and hold the volume down even with a big gain increase. And inspired by the guitarists, I've actually used my mixer to do the trick. So I've cranked the volume in the synth all the way up, but in my mixer the synth channel was set all the way down. And I think that this did the trick for me. I actually got much more range to play with my feedback knob, finding distorted sweet spots before reaching this no pitch territory, and all that without clipping, nor having this bass sound up front on the mix. This was my first learning using the mixer as attenuator and boosting the synth output there. But this was not the end of the story for me. If we think about what saturation is, you add a lot of gain, turning the edges of your waveform quite steep, and then you limit the wave amplitude, and the more you limit, the more square your wave gets. Hey, it's me from editing here. I think that I have to add an explanation to this. The reason why the wave is clipping is because you reach the point of saturation of your media, and that can be your digital media, magnetic tape, or even the circuit of an amplifier. Additionally, all the harmonics that are generated by the feedback loop will actually interfere destructively with the peak of the wave, canceling each other out, which will also contribute to the resulting wave format. The resulting wave is very close to the square wave, but the little imperfections of your limit create these interesting harmonics that may not be even there from the start. Not to say that the feedback loop itself creates resonances, but these actually created a trap for me because these resonances were easily going out of control. So my first instinct was trying to isolate these new harmonics using the emphasis. I got to a point that in order to control the distortion bite from the feedback loop, I could use 4 different knobs to achieve the exact same result. Let me explain. I was knobbing my way to my desired timbre here on the high register, focusing on the lead sound, tuning my timbre while holding this note in sustain. Because the filter envelope modulation was changing my cutoff frequency point in time, so I had to hold it down to its sustain level. But then I will have to repeat this whole process while holding down the bass notes in sustain here on the lower register. And that's because, if you remember here, we had key track engaged, meaning that effectively my cutoff frequency would change while playing in the lead zone here in comparison to the bass lower octave register there. But remember what I said. Feedback is also resonance. It creates resonances and reveal harmonics that you can actually tune by emphasizing them. And I got to a point where my feedback level here could generate anything from a sub-bass frequency octave all the way up to higher octave sounds. And this is hard to tame when you think about modulation in time, because while this envelope here was changing my cutoff frequency, the harmonics pitch would vary, creating almost like a siren effect when I was reaching the peak of my attack amplitude there, both for the amplifier level that would contribute to the overall feedback loop, but also by opening my cutoff frequency here. And that meant that even by altering the volume of my sound source in the mixer here, my oscillator, I would also affect my sweet spot on feedback there. Let me show you this in practice a little bit. Like here's where you can actually tune those harmonics. Here's where we get the lower octave ones when the oscillator volume is down. Feedback here, I get to that point where the saturation starts to bite. And you always have to test both on the lead level, but also in the bass. And you see here how I easily got to a point where I'm losing pitch information. And my sweet spot there is exactly at this point where the envelope modulation will start tapping into the distortion territory. forcing me to start playing the other notes before the whole sound cracks down. Well, to sum it up, if I haven't lost you already, thanks for following me in my reflections here. I think that the end result, as seen in the spectrometer here, create this sine-like waveform on the lower registers, and that wave morphs into a more square wave while playing in the higher octaves or when we are doing the long sustained notes. I believe that the original sound is much more muffled and contained, but this also has to do with the overall mix with vocals and the other elements in the song, but I'm pretty happy with the aggressive version of it as well, and I learned a couple of tricks to build a very versatile sound that can have the role of a lead and bass, automatically. And you can use your playing dynamics to control it by, for instance, re-triggering your envelope for every note, emphasizing this reverse illusion, or by playing notes in legato, leaving your filter much more open, allowing your waveform to get closer to the square. But in any case, this playing dynamic also kind of puts you into a different groove, a different tempo, which I think is a very attractive element for the original song. And I personally believe that this groove is what makes Atoms for a Piece rarely use the MS-20 in their live presentations, or even the reason behind Tom York actually creating a piano arrangement to play this song live, because it really tricks the brain, creating a special groove that is hard to sing along. Well, I hope that you have learned something today, as I did while making this content for you. And I'm trying new formats all the time. So for those of you following me for some time, let me know what you think about this other format here. And as always, thanks for watching.